The general stood on the ridge with his binoculars pressed against his face, scanning the horizon where his men would soon appear. He had led these soldiers through campaigns that turned ordinary men into legends, battles where courage alone seemed enough to bend the outcome of entire wars. Today should have been different. Today was supposed to be a textbook operation, the kind of carefully planned assault that military academies would study for generations. His intelligence officers had given him their assurances with the kind of confidence that came from maps and aerial photographs and intercepted communications. The drop zone was clear, they told him. The enemy had withdrawn. His paratroopers would land, regroup, and execute their mission before resistance could even organize. He believed them because believing them made sense, because the alternative seemed impossible to imagine. And so he watched the sky, waiting for the distant drone of aircraft engines that would carry his elite soldiers toward what everyone promised would be a swift and decisive victory. The sound came first as a whisper, then as a rumble that grew until it filled the entire valley with mechanical thunder. Transport planes materialized against the pale morning sky, black silhouettes moving in perfect formation like migrating birds following ancient routes written into their very bones. Inside those aircraft, 1,500 of Germany's finest airborne soldiers sat in tight rows, their parachutes already strapped to their backs, their weapons secured, their minds focused on the task ahead. These were not conscripts pulled from villages and given rifles and pointed toward the enemy. These were volunteers who had endured selection processes that broke most men before they even reached basic training. They had jumped from aircraft in conditions that would terrify experienced pilots. They had fought in places where conventional armies could not go, where the only supply line was the sky itself, where survival depended on skill and teamwork and a kind of controlled aggression that turned chaos into opportunity. Their commander knew what they were capable of because he had seen them do impossible things before. He had watched them take fortified positions with nothing but small arms and grenades. He had seen them hold ground against overwhelming numbers until relief arrived. He trusted them with his life, and they trusted him with theirs, and that mutual confidence had carried them through campaigns that destroyed lesser units. The first aircraft began its approach over the designated drop zone, descending to the altitude where human bodies could safely separate from machines and fall toward Earth with fabric canopies to slow their descent. The general tracked it through his binoculars, watching as the side doors opened and tiny figures began to emerge, tumbling into space before their parachutes blossomed above them like strange flowers growing in reverse. He counted them out of habit, watching each man become a white dot suspended in the air, drifting down toward the ground that intelligence had promised was safe. The second plane followed, then the third, and soon the sky was filled with descending paratroopers, a sight that should have filled him with pride and anticipation. This was what his men trained for. This was the moment when all that preparation transformed into action, when theory became reality, when plans written on paper manifested as boots on hostile ground. The first explosion came as a sharp crack that echoed across the valley, distinct and wrong in a way that made his stomach tighten before his mind fully processed what was happening. Through the binoculars, he saw a paratrooper disappear in a burst of dirt and smoke, his chute collapsing as the blast threw his body like a ragdoll. The general's hands went rigid on the binoculars, his breathing stopped, his entire world contracting to that single point of horror. Another explosion followed, then another, the sounds coming faster now, overlapping into a continuous rolling thunder that had nothing to do with aircraft engines. Across the drop zone, his men were landing directly on top of mines, their weight triggering explosions that had been waiting patiently in the earth for exactly this kind of pressure. Some died before they even touched ground, caught by blasts while still suspended in the air, their chutes shredded by shrapnel that turned fabric into ribbons. Others landed safely only to take a single step and vanish in clouds of dirt and flame. The general watched it happen with the kind of helpless clarity that comes when disaster unfolds too fast to stop but slow enough to see every terrible detail. His intelligence officers had been wrong, catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. The enemy had not withdrawn. They had prepared an ambush more devastating than any conventional defensive position could have achieved. Someone on the other side had predicted exactly where German paratroopers would land, had calculated the approach vectors and identified the terrain features that would seem most attractive as a drop zone, and had then spent days or perhaps weeks carefully planting mines across every square meter of that ground. It was the kind of methodical, Patient work that required imagination and effort and a willingness to invest resources into a trap that might never spring. But it had sprung now, and the results were exactly what whoever laid those mines must have hoped for. German paratroopers were dying not in combat but in a mechanical slaughter that gave them no chance to fight back, no opportunity to use their training, no way to apply the courage and skill that made them elite soldiers. They were simply falling into a trap that consumed them as efficiently as a machine processes raw materials. The general began shouting orders, his voice cutting through the shock that had frozen his staff into silent witnesses. Aircraft still in formation needed to be warned, told to abort their drops, directed to alternative zones that might not be mined. Radio operators scrambled to make contact with pilots who were following their flight plans exactly as briefed, who had no reason to suspect anything was wrong until they heard the frantic transmissions telling them to break off, to climb, to stop sending men into a killing field. Some pilots heard the warnings in time and pulled up, their transport planes climbing away with their human cargo still aboard, the soldiers inside confused and frustrated but alive. Other pilots never received the message, their radio frequencies crowded with competing transmissions or their attention focused on the precision flying required to maintain formation. They continued their approaches and opened their doors and sent their men tumbling into the air over ground that had already claimed dozens of their comrades. On the drop zone itself, the survivors were discovering just how thoroughly the trap had been set. Every obvious path off the mined area was itself mined. Every piece of cover that might have provided shelter from potential gunfire had explosives buried nearby. The enemy had thought through the psychology of paratroopers under fire, had anticipated how trained soldiers would react to landing under attack, and had positioned their minds accordingly. Men who tried to run to safety triggered more explosions. Men who froze in place and called for engineers found themselves pinned down in the open, unable to move without risking the same fate that had killed their friends. Some of the more experienced soldiers began marking safe paths with whatever materials they could find, using parachute fabric and equipment straps to create visual markers that showed where men had walked without dying. It was desperate improvisation that saved some lives, but the cost of discovering where the safe ground existed was measured in bodies and the screams of wounded men whose injuries were of the kind that came from explosions rather than bullets. The general continued to watch because looking away felt like abandoning his men, even though there was nothing he could do from his observation post except witness the consequences of decisions he had approved based on intelligence he had trusted. His mind was already working through the cascade of failures that had led to this moment. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed the drop zone multiple times, and none of those images had revealed mine-laying activity. Either the enemy had worked at night or had been exceptionally careful about concealing their preparations, or the photo interpreters had failed to recognize the subtle signs that would have indicated the ground was being disturbed. Local informants had reported enemy movements away from the area, information that now seemed suspiciously convenient, as if it had been deliberately fed to German intelligence to encourage exactly the kind of confidence that led commanders to approve risky operations. Counterintelligence protocols were supposed to catch that kind of deception, but clearly something in the verification process had failed, or perhaps the information had seemed too consistent with other intelligence to raise suspicions. Below, medics were trying to reach wounded men while engineers worked to clear pathways through the minefield using methods that were painfully slow when men were bleeding out in the dirt. Every movement had to be deliberate, every step potentially fatal, every decision weighted with the knowledge that a mistake would create more casualties rather than prevent them. Some wounded soldiers tried to crawl toward help and triggered secondary explosions. Others lay still and called out for assistance that took agonizing minutes to arrive, if it came at all. The psychological impact on the survivors was something that would last far beyond this single operation. These were men who had faced enemy fire and survived through skill and aggression, who had been trained to close with the enemy and fight at close quarters where determination often mattered more than firepower. But mines were impersonal killers that offered no target to shoot back at, no enemy to engage. No way to fight except through careful, methodical caution that went against every instinct their training had cultivated. The general finally lowered his binoculars and turned to his staff, his face showing the kind of controlled fury that comes when anger has nowhere productive to go. Questions needed to be asked about how intelligence could have been so comprehensively wrong, about what procedures had failed, about who had approved the information that led to this disaster. But those questions would have to wait because right now there were men trapped in a minefield who needed immediate support. He began issuing rapid-fire orders that redirected resources toward rescue and medical evacuation rather than the combat operations that were supposed to follow the airborne assault. Artillery units that had been positioned to support the paratroopers' advance were instead tasked with firing smoke rounds to provide visual cover for rescue efforts. Infantry units that were supposed to link up with the airborne forces were redirected to secure the edges of the minefield and establish casualty collection points. Medical personnel began preparing for the kinds of traumatic injuries that mines produced, injuries that were often survivable if treatment came quickly enough but fatal if delayed. The enemy, having set their traps so carefully, did not follow up with any aggressive action. There was no artillery barrage to compound the casualties, no infantry assault to catch the survivors while they were disorganized and vulnerable. Perhaps they lacked the forces to exploit the situation, or perhaps they understood that the minefield was doing exactly what it was designed to do and any additional action would be redundant. From their perspective, the operation was an overwhelming success. They had neutralized a significant German airborne force without expending ammunition or risking their own soldiers in direct combat. They had proven that elite troops could be defeated by simple engineering and patient preparation, that courage and training meant nothing against explosives buried in the dirt. The psychological impact would extend far beyond the immediate casualties, creating hesitation and doubt among German commanders who would now have to question whether their intelligence was trustworthy, whether their planned operations were walking into similar traps. As the sun climbed higher and the full scope of the disaster became apparent, rescue teams managed to establish narrow, safe corridors through portions of the minefield, pathways that allowed medics and stretcher bearers to reach some of the wounded. The recovery effort would continue for hours, a grinding process of careful probing and marking and movement that saved lives at a pace that felt agonizingly slow to everyone involved. Some men who had landed in the minefield and survived the initial explosions through luck or positioning would spend hours lying motionless, afraid to move, waiting for help to reach them. The psychological strain of that experience, knowing that any shift in weight or attempt to stand might trigger the explosion that had somehow missed them on landing, was the kind of trauma that would haunt men for the rest of their lives. The final casualty count would confirm what the general had already accepted as he watched his men die. This was one of the most devastating single-day losses his unit had ever suffered, and it had come not from superior enemy tactics on the battlefield but from a combination of bad intelligence and an adversary who had outthought German planning. Of the 1,500 elite paratroopers who had boarded those aircraft expecting a difficult but manageable combat drop, hundreds were dead or wounded before they had fired a single shot. The survivors were traumatized and scattered, their combat effectiveness compromised even after they were eventually extracted from the minefield and reorganized. The unit would require weeks or months to absorb replacements and rebuild the cohesion that made it effective, time during which it would be unavailable for other operations that might have benefited from its specialized capabilities. In the aftermath, the investigation into what went wrong would reveal layers of failure that extended far beyond a single bad intelligence report. The pressure to maintain aggressive operations had created an environment where commanders were incentivized to approve risky plans, where questioning intelligence estimates could be interpreted as lack of confidence or offensive spirit. Photo reconnaissance procedures had gaps that allowed enemy deception efforts to succeed. Human intelligence networks had been penetrated or manipulated in ways that fed German planning exactly the kind of information that would encourage catastrophic decisions. Counterintelligence protocols existed but had not been applied rigorously enough to catch the warning signs that might have revealed the trap. And fundamentally, there had been a failure of imagination among German staff officers who could not conceive that the enemy might invest the enormous effort required to mine an entire drop zone on the possibility that German paratroopers might use it. The general would face questions about why he had trusted the intelligence without demanding additional verification, why he had not insisted on preliminary reconnaissance in force before committing his entire unit, why the operation had proceeded despite the inherent risks of airborne assault into potentially hostile territory. Some of those questions were fair, reflecting genuine failures in his decision-making process. Others came from officers who had not been present, who had not felt the pressure to act, who could judge his choices with the clarity that came from knowing the outcome. He accepted responsibility because that was what commanders did, But he also understood that the failure was systemic rather than individual, that the problems that led to this disaster existed throughout the military structure and would likely cause similar catastrophes unless fundamental changes were made. For the soldiers who survived, the experience would become a defining moment that shaped how they thought about warfare and risk and the reliability of the institutions they served. Men who had jumped from aircraft dozens of times without hesitation would now carry the memory of watching their friends die in explosions they could not predict or prevent. The confidence that came from elite training and successful combat experience would be tempered by the knowledge that all their skill meant nothing against a well-executed trap. Some would request transfers to other units, unwilling to continue in a role that had revealed itself to be so vulnerable to this kind of catastrophic failure. Others would remain with the airborne forces but would approach every subsequent operation with heightened caution, questioning intelligence estimates, demanding additional verification, insisting on backup plans and alternative drop zones. The broader strategic impact of the disaster extended beyond the immediate loss of combat capability. Word of what had happened would spread through the military, reaching other airborne units and the commanders who planned their operations. Future airborne assaults would be subject to much more stringent intelligence requirements, with multiple verification methods required before drop zones could be approved. Some planned operations would be cancelled entirely when intelligence could not provide the level of certainty that was now demanded. This increased caution would prevent some disasters but would also eliminate opportunities that might have succeeded if attempted, creating a kind of paralysis that affected German airborne operations for the remainder of the war. The enemy, observing this shift in German behavior, would understand that their minefield had achieved effects far beyond the immediate casualties, that they had injected doubt and hesitation into German planning that would pay dividends in future engagements. The commander who had ordered the minefield to be laid, whose name might never appear in history books but whose decision had such devastating consequences, had understood something fundamental about warfare that many of his contemporaries missed. Killing enemy soldiers was only one way to achieve military objectives, and often not the most efficient. Creating conditions where elite units could be neutralized without direct combat, where the enemy's strengths could be turned into vulnerabilities, where psychological impact compounded physical losses, these were the methods that produced strategic results disproportionate to the resources invested. The minefield had required significant effort to construct and had consumed explosives that might have been used for other purposes, but the return on that investment was extraordinary. A single defensive preparation had effectively destroyed a German airborne unit's combat capability for months and had influenced German operational planning across the entire theater. As the sun began to set on that terrible day, the last of the wounded had been evacuated and the dead were being recovered from the minefield by teams who worked with the kind of grim determination that came from knowing these were comrades who deserved proper burial. The general remained at his observation post, watching the operation continue into darkness under artificial lights that turned the valley into a surreal landscape of shadows and illuminated patches of disturbed earth. He was already writing the report in his mind, choosing words that would convey the magnitude of the disaster without seeming like he was making excuses or shifting blame. The report would be read by senior commanders who would demand explanations and accountability, who would want to know how this could have been prevented, who would implement changes designed to ensure it never happened again. But the general knew that war was a contest between opponents who were both trying to outthink each other, both looking for advantages and vulnerabilities, both making decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain predictions. Today his enemy had been smarter or luckier or more thorough in their preparations. Another day the situation might reverse, and German planning might achieve the kind of success that came from superior intelligence or better execution or simple good fortune. That uncertainty was fundamental to combat, and no amount of improved procedures or reformed training could eliminate it entirely. What could be changed was how seriously intelligence was questioned, how rigorously estimates were verified, how much redundancy was built into plans to account for the possibility that initial assumptions might be wrong. The men who died in the minefield would be remembered in official histories as casualties of war, their deaths attributed to enemy action in the same category as soldiers killed by bullets or artillery. But their comrades would remember them differently, as victims of a failure that should have been prevented, as evidence that even elite soldiers with superior training could be killed by simple mistakes made far from the battlefield. That memory would persist long after the war ended, carried by the survivors into civilian life, where they would sometimes speak about what they had seen, about watching friends die needlessly, about the moment when they realized their commanders had sent them into a trap that someone should have anticipated. Those stories would become part of the oral history of the war, accounts that complicated the official narratives of heroism and sacrifice with uncomfortable truths about incompetence and institutional failure. For historians who would later examine this operation, the Minefield incident would serve as a case study in the importance of intelligence verification and the risks of overconfidence. Military academies would analyze what went wrong, using the disaster as a teaching tool to illustrate how cascading small failures could combine into catastrophic outcomes. Students would study the decisions that led to the operation being approved, the procedures that failed to catch the warning signs, the alternatives that existed but were not pursued. Some would argue that the general should have recognized the risks and refused to proceed without better intelligence. Others would note that commanders who questioned their orders or demanded impossible standards of certainty would never accomplish anything, that war required accepting risk and sometimes those risks resulted in losses. The debate would continue without resolution because the fundamental tension between caution and aggression, between thorough preparation and timely action, was inherent to military operations and could not be solved through hindsight or theoretical analysis. The legacy of that day would extend far beyond the immediate participants, influencing how nations thought about airborne operations and the vulnerabilities that came with them. The mine trap demonstrated that paratroopers, for all their elite training and aggressive spirit, were extraordinarily vulnerable during the landing phase when they were scattered and disorganized and unable to bring their weapons to bear effectively. This vulnerability could be exploited by enemies who were willing to invest the effort required to prepare comprehensive defenses, who could predict where drops might occur and turn those locations into killing grounds. The realization would affect post-war military doctrine, leading to developments in mine detection technology, changes in airborne tactics that emphasize dispersed landings and rapid assembly, and a greater appreciation for the intelligence requirements that had to be met before airborne assaults could be responsibly attempted. Standing on that ridge as darkness fully claimed the valley, the general finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. These were his men, soldiers he had led and trained and fought beside, whose families would receive notification that their sons or husbands or fathers had been killed in action. Those notifications would not explain that death had come from stepping on mines in a landing zone that should have been safe, that their loved ones had been betrayed by intelligence failures and institutional overconfidence, that they had died without the chance to fight back or demonstrate the courage that had earned them their elite status. The families would grieve and would believe their losses had meaning within the larger context of the war, and perhaps that belief was necessary because the alternative, understanding that death had come from preventable mistakes, might be unbearable. Tomorrow would bring new orders and new operations, the machinery of war continuing regardless of individual tragedies. The unit would be rebuilt with replacements who had not experienced this disaster, who would be told about it during training but would not fully understand until they faced their own moments of helpless horror watching plans disintegrate in ways no one had predicted. The survivors would be redistributed to other units or retained to train the new recruits, their experience considered valuable despite or perhaps because of the trauma it represented. And the general would continue commanding because that was his duty and his skill, though he would carry with him always the memory of watching 1,500 elite soldiers drop into a minefield because he had believed intelligence officers who had been catastrophically wrong. That memory would inform every subsequent decision he made, creating a caution that might save lives in future operations or might cause him to hesitate when aggression was required, and he would never be entirely certain which impulse was correct until events had already determined the outcome.